why it's a measuring jug. I'm a very practical person, and then I can use it as a mug and as a measuring jug as well. So that's why, so I don't like to have a lot of things. So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to meet you. I was really thrilled actually to learn of the existence of both Queer Disrupt and the Muslim Cultures and Societies program at the Berlin Graduate School. It's just the kind of Islamic studies that I could only dream of 15 years ago, even more than 15 years ago now, when I was starting on my academic journey. So thanks again for sharing your event with me and for inviting me to give the closing lecture for this conference. It's very meaningful to me on a personal level. I want to share the background of this work that I'm about to share with you. A few years ago, I worked with scholar Amina Wadud, the author of Quran and Woman, on a research project that was looking at gender and sexual diversity in Islamic theology. And in working with her, of course, I learned a lot. And I never really shared my findings from that research up until now. So that's a beautiful thing, that you get to see, what we found. But more, so I don't know if Dr. Wadud has published anything on that yet. I haven't seen it, but I'm just going to share with you my impressions of what I saw. And before that, maybe I just give you a little bit of an idea that I went into the study of gender and sexual diversity in Islamic theology because I saw an injustice and I wanted to contribute to a discourse that looked for solutions to that injustice. As a native Arabic speaker, I had access to the revered texts of Islam. And as a non-Muslim, I didn't have the reluctance that many people from my culture have about reading these texts as literature and kind of more from a secular perspective. At a conference I was at with Scott Kugel, the author of Homosexuality in Islam, a few years ago, he likened what I call queer-friendly Islamic hermeneutics and exegetics to liberation theology. So liberation theology comes from the time when Catholic priests in Latin America played a critical role in organizing people against oppressive regimes. So at the time, I thought that liberation theology was a fitting metaphor for the role that queer-friendly Islamic hermeneutics plays in the lives of queer Muslims, especially those who suffer as a result of the seeming conflict between their faith and who they feel they are or want to be. And I just want to preface before I start that I'm going to assume that the target audience here are not students of Islamic theology or necessarily specialists in any of the disciplines that I'm going to touch on today. And I'm happy to see I've been proven wrong about this. So that's really wonderful. But for that reason, some of the information that I give here today might feel really basic to you, but I think even with specialists, it's always good to define the terms that we're using so that we're all on the same page. So with that, I want to actually start at the end. What do I think after 20 years or so of thinking about and researching on gender and sexual diversity in Islamic theology? What do I think is the nature of the conflict between mainstream Islam and queer Islamic liberation theology? And I've actually found that the essence of the problem is not in the details, and this will not be news to many of you, I'm sure, what I'm about to say. It's not about how many verses there are in the Quran about the people of Lot, or whether the people of Lot can reasonably stand in for consensual sexual relationships between adults of the same sex or not. It's not about the details at all. It's actually about the incommensurability between how these two systems of thought, normative Islamic theology and queer liberation theology, are structured that causes the impasse. So let me share with you a model of what those generic or genetic differences between these two systems of thought are. The caveat, of course, is that a model is naturally going to have an imperfect fit with all the facts, and it's going to be reductive. So it's a model of best fit, it's not a model of perfect fit. And so to do that, let's lay out some terms. First, epistemology. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge, of a system of thought. It's how that system of thought arrives at whether something is true or whether it is just an opinion or even a false belief. So it looks for true beliefs, justified true beliefs, and it looks for false beliefs as well. Axiology is the theory of value and the values of a system of thought. What or who does that system hold to be valuable? What are the system's values, like honesty and integrity, for instance? So for, scholarships, axiology is the truth is of value, and honesty and integrity might be that system's values. Another example, sons in a patriarchal system of thought are valued, and daughters also have an exchange value, but the value of the daughters is different from that of the value of the sons. And it would be right to say that they are of lesser value. And the values of a tribal patriarchal system of thought might be centered around honor and the capacity to dominate. Then there is ontology. Ontology is the theory of being. And by that, we usually mean the theory of human being. What is the nature of human existence? How did the human come to be? How was the human created? What is the human for? Who does the human serve? So a materialist ontology, for example, would say that all human beings are a composite of sophisticated biological systems that evolved out of millennia of chemical chain reactions. Monotheistic ontology might say human beings are essentially spiritual animals created as a whole in the blink of an eye, like the creationist ontology, and that have some form of existence after the decomposition of the body so that they can face, judgment at least. And finally, cosmology and eschatology. Cosmology is that system's theory of the origin and destiny of the world. How was it created? What are its governing principles? What is its destiny? And eschatology usually refers to Christian doctrine, but we can generalize it to be the theory of what happens to us when we die. What are the consequences of how we lived our lives? Judgment Day, heaven, hell, purgatory, could even be reincarnation, and so on. So let's start with epistemology, and of course, by implication, semiotics, the theory of meaning. In normative Islamic theology, meaning is fixed. The earliest interpretations are the most valid. In Sunni Islam, the canonical exegetical texts for both the Quran and the Hadith didn't actually come into being until the 9th century, approximately 300 years after the Prophet died. Even so, the pervasive belief is that those interpretations and those Hadith collections are what constitute the true Islam and the true meaning of Islamic texts. The Shiite exegetical tradition has a different set of canonical books, but for this lecture, I'm going to focus my attention on the Sunni canonical texts, specifically Tabari's Quranic exegesis, his books of tafsir, and the authenticated hadiths by al-Bukhari, who invented the chain of transmission methodology, and al-Muslim. And all three scholars are citizens of the 9th century. So what does it mean when in classical theology, the meaning is fixed? You can see this pretty much everywhere in a Quranic interpretation, but if we take a particular verse that's meaningful to us, that might be a good entry point. So let's look at verse chapter 49, verse 13. And I think all translations here are mine. And the verse reads, I'll read the Arabic first for those of you who would like that. يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. O people, we created you from a dhakar and untha and made you peoples and tribes so that you may know each other. The most honored among you by God are those of you who are most mindful of him. God is all-knowing. In Tabari's tafsir, dhakar wa untha, so we created you from these two things, dhakar and untha. In Tabari's tafsir, the meaning is fixed that it really means man and woman. And this is how he explains that part of the verse. I'll read the silsila. حدثنا أبو هشام قال ثنى عبيد الله بن موسى قال أخبرنا عثمان بن الأسود عن مجاهد قال خلق الله الولد من ماء الرجل وماء المرأة وقد قال تبارك وتعالى. So he's explaining, يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى, O people, we created you from a ذكر and أنثى, as meaning, sorry, I didn't read you the translation, sorry. Abu Hisham told us, Ubayd Allah bin Musa also said that Uthman bin Aswad told us, based on what he heard from Mujahid, he said, God created the child from the fluids of the man and the fluids of the woman. So we created you from a dhakar and untha, could be, so basically we created you from a man and woman. And so the meaning is fixed in traditional Islamic theology. And it seems like a small point to be labored, but really a lot hinges on this. So when At-Tabari says that dhakar and untha refers to a man and woman coming together to produce offspring, he's leaving out that in Arabic, the word dhakar and untha could mean male and female. And it also reference masculine and feminine, specifically in linguistics, because Arabic is a gendered language. So like the sun is feminine, the moon is masculine. So every noun has a gender. So in queer Islamic liberation theology, the meaning is not fixed to what At-Tabari explained in the 9th century. Meaning is constructed. It's dependent on the interpreter and their context. There's nothing divinely ordained about At-Tabari, his time or his context. And there's nothing in the Quran or the Hadith that says 300 years after the Prophet dies, some books of tafsir are going to be created by these incredibly diligent scholars, and you'll have to abide by the interpretations they give you for all eternity. The view in Islamic feminism and among progressive theologians who are indebted to Islamic feminist thinking and methodology is that we don't have to be bound to the interpretative tradition, which is by nature naturally patriarchal, given its context. This is because the interpretative tradition is not the Quran itself, and it's not Islam itself either, no matter how many centuries we might have believed that to be the case. So if meaning is constructed and dependent on the interpreter and their context, therefore it's always changing from person to person, from time to time, from geography to geography. So Amina Wadud interprets dhakar wa untha as the essences of masculine and feminine. So we created you from the masculine and feminine. And she would interpret this verse completely differently on that strength. She still has a binary system, but it's not a biological sex binary system. It's like a yin and yang. And we all have different mixtures of these two complementary elements of this yin and yang. So if the epistemology leads us to the belief that human beings are created from a man and woman strictly, and at the same time meaning is fixed, then a transgender man who becomes pregnant with a baby of a transgender woman cannot be acknowledged as a transgender man who got pregnant. He's seen as a female, or more specifically as a woman, according to Tabari, whose fluids mixed with those of a male, and more specifically a man, in order to conceive, no matter what the transgender couples say. But if meaning is constructed, then there is room for a transgender man to say, I am a man who is pregnant and he's going to have a child with a transgender woman. And this is very different from a cisgendered woman who gets pregnant. So when you have a traditional epistemology, so that's, there are consequences to the traditional epistemology. So when you have that epistemology, it also requires the meaning to be fixed to the people who originally interpreted the Quran. And then as a result, they end up having to make exclusions of other possibilities, even when the Quran potentially contains those possibilities. So let me give you an example of what I mean. So it's not just that they fix the meaning when the meaning could potentially look like dhakar and untha. Obviously, it's talking about male, female, man, woman, but even when it's not, even when the text itself is not doing that, they have to fix it. They perform what I call a kind of interpretative violence, and it's violence from my perspective, right? But maybe from their perspective, it's protective, interpretative protection, right? So let me give you an example from chapter 4, verse 1. يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء. O people, be mindful of your Lord who created you from a single nafs and created from it its mate and emitted from both of them many men and women. Now, what's interesting about this verse, first of all, this is an ontological axiom, I guess, in the Quran. The Quran is telling us that all human beings have been created from a single source. The origin of all human beings is a single entity. It's the nafs, and the nafs can be interpreted to mean spirit, self, soul, or essence, right? And the word itself is a gendered word, and it's a feminine gendered word, right? And so you could argue, as Nawal Saadawi once did, that the origin is feminine or the origin is female. Al-Untha Hiya Al-Asl was one of her books, which like the female is the origin. But if it's just if the word is just gendered linguistically, then this single essence, this single soul, this single spirit is actually genderless. It's sexless. It doesn't have a sex. It is the origin of everything. It has a feminine word, and from it, its mate was created. Like something was taken out of it, and its mate, its zawj, its pair, was created. And this word, the word mate, zawj, was masculine. It could have been a zawja in Arabic very easily, and it could have been a feminine noun, right? So, but the choice here is that the origin is sexless and genderless. And if you're going to ascribe a gender to it, it's a feminine gender, and then comes its mate. Right, and the reason I belabor this is that when you look at the in tafsir by Tabari, he fixes this inconvenience by relating the Judeo-Christian Genesis story, which is that this nafs is Adam, with who is not just male but also a man, and not just masculine but also a man. So he takes out the genderlessness or the potential feminine gender of the word nafs, and he replaces it with Adam, and the mate then becomes, guess who? It's Eve. So he switches really what's contained in the Quran, the ontology, the human ontology of the Quran, to making sure that Adam is the origin, not this genderless thing. And out of Adam comes secondarily Eve, just to make sure that the Quran stays within the confines of a patriarchal axiology where the male comes first. That's why it's more valuable. So point number one is that in traditional Islamic epistemology, meaning is fixed, and 9th century interpreters of the Quran are closer to the truth of the meaning of the Quran than anything else. And if you just take a moment to think about the, like historians and literary scholars, we really appreciate when we're trying to understand a text of going back to the way it was written and understood and intended to be understood at the time of its creation. So I don't think these 9th century interpreters of the Quran were necessarily doing anything wrong. But if you stop there, that kind of creates more issues. We can just talk about that a little later. And so, again, it's, the example I just gave you is not the only time the interpretive tradition tries to successfully patches up perhaps a potentially embarrassing deviation in scripture from their epistemology and their cosmology. There's also the matter of what's known as the satanic verses in the Quran. There's a wonderful book on this by Shahab Ahmad called Before Orthodoxy, the Satanic Verses in Early Islam. And clearly what you see is how the incident of what's called the Satanic Verses went from being acknowledged as having happened to becoming something that never happened, to being denied. So there is a verse that you will not find in the Quran, or there's a completion of a verse that you will not find in the Quran, in chapter 53, verses 19 to 20. And it reads, أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ اللَّاتَ وَالْعُزَّى وَمَنَاةَ الثَّالِثَةَ الْأُخْرَى تِلْكَ الْغَرَانِيقُ الْعُلَى وَشَفَاعَتُهُنَّ تُرْجَى. So you'll see the first bit, but the very last bit that says وَشَفَاعَتُهُنَّ تُرْجَى has been removed from the Quran. And the verse is, have you seen Allat and Al-Uzza wa Manat, the third one? these white birds above whose intercessions can be sought. The whose intercessions can be sought is what has been eliminated. So who are these three characters? Allat, Al-Uzza, wa Manat. So in the tribe of Quraysh used to worship these three female deities, Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. And they had these large white statues of like birds, and the idols, their idols. And they would pray to those and ask them to intercede on their behalf, like for favors or to bless them or to get them out of a difficulty, just in the way like the Catholic tradition has saints, and you can pray to the saints to intercede on your behalf to Jesus or God or whatever. So what the Quran here is saying is that you can use these deities, these idols, for intercession. And so what that contradicts is the doctrine of monotheism. God doesn't have any partners or equals. That's very clear in the Quran, and it's a major sin if you're to continue to worship anything besides him. But what's interesting is that these are three female deities as well, right? And so they have been erased through the interpretative tradition. And there's a lot of debate about what actually happened that day when the Prophet Muhammad was praying in the presence of the tribe of Quraysh when this happened. And originally, they say that he said it. He said that their intercessions can be sought. And later, the angel Gabriel came down and told him that was the devil. He put those words in your mouth. And he felt really, really bad. And then another verse came down that said, don't worry if that happens. All my prophets have been tricked by Satan. But I, as in God, always make sure that the truth prevails, or something to that effect. I think it's Surah Al-Hajj. At any rate, the interpretive tradition then says, well, if the Prophet Muhammad was tricked by the devil, that puts all his revelations into question. So that can't be true. So it must be that it was the devil pretending, imitating the voice of Muhammad, so that everybody there who heard that section thought it was Muhammad who said it, but Muhammad never actually said it. And then eventually it became that the story never happened, right? So you can see here, like, it's really embarrassing, but these three female deities that are just basically their potency has been successfully erased from the Quran through the interpretative tradition. So let's turn to axiology. Axiology is a theory of value of that system of thought. In the normative belief system, value is generated through taqwa. Inna akramakum indallah atqakum. The first verse I read to you contains these words. The most honored by God among you are the most mindful of him. Taqwa is traditionally interpreted as fear of God, but it's consciousness of God. So the fear of God is not necessarily a literal fear, it's the awareness of the mindfulness of God. It's before I do something, I think about what would God approve of this, right? So that's what taqwa is. And value in normative theology is generated through taqwa, which is abiding by the rules that are set forth in the Quran and by example of the life of the Prophet. And there's also value in male and female coming together, as long as that coming together is Islamically lawful. Anything outside of that has no value, has lesser value, or even negative value, like celibacy or, on more extreme, fornication, zina, for example. In the emancipatory model, the value of beings is intrinsic. You don't have to be a reproductive being to have value. You don't have to be married to have value. You don't have to be male or female or act according to the expectations set in the Sunnah of how men and women dress and behave in order to have value. Value is intrinsic. A human being is valuable just by virtue of being human. And I want to circle back to ontology, because we already talked a little bit about that and saw that human beings originate from a single spiritual essence, a single nafs. But also ontologically, what's the purpose of a human being? Why are they there? So human beings are spiritual creations of God to whom they must submit. Chapter 51, verse 56 says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I only created jinn and humans so that they can worship, and obviously me, because they can't worship anything else. Chapter 2, verse 21, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسِ اعْبُدُوا رَبَّكُمْ. O humankind, worship your Lord. And so the definition of worship, according to At-Tabari, is al-khudu' lillah bit-ta'a, submission to God through obedience. Do what God says, what he says specifically. But then who tells us what God says we're supposed to do are those scholars in the 9th century. They're intermediaries, they're brokers of the epistemology. In liberation ontology, humans are spiritual creations of God as well, but they can form a personal relationship with God. In fact, they have to, because the regime of worship is so oppressive. This is what it means to engage in liberation theology for queer Muslims. And of course, then obedience can take on completely different meanings, because it can mean that to obey God is to live according to your true nature. And your true nature may not be what's authorized by the community of believers at a given time. We see this incommensurability of ontologies in a lot of the sociological literature on queer Muslims up to 2014. Who regularly express having to leave their communities of faith and to practice their belief system in isolation. The other option is to enter a kind of gay affirmative spaces, and usually those spaces are intolerant of all religions, or they might be intolerant of the ethno-religious identity of a queer Muslim. So in these studies, queer Muslims often express having a relationship with God, but also having to walk away from communal expressions of worship. Of course, that's all starting to change with, queer inclusive mosques, and there are several, especially in Europe and North America. So, but this experience of having to walk away from a community of faith and have a personal relationship with God is a transnational experience. Studies in India, Indonesia, Australia, Germany, Belgium, Canada, the UK, and the US tend to make similar reports. Finally, we'll take a look at the differences between the cosmologies and eschatologies of canonical theology versus traditional theology. Versus liberation theology. In a traditional worldview, God created the world. He controls it and is outside of it. There's nothing in the world that resembles him. In liberation theology, God is sometimes described as being intertwined with the world. Think, for example, in Sufi mysticism, God is the beloved, God is passive, God is feminine. So both Sufi mysticism and Islamic liberation theology restore those elements to God that were excoriated in the 9th century. Eschatology, liberation theology, doesn't harp much about fire and brimstone, because that's what it's trying to heal people from, is that fear, what's going to happen to me, eternal damnation. It doesn't dwell in punishment for sin, and it doesn't entertain the idea that homosexuality or gender variance are sin. It doesn't actually address, from what I've seen, the issue of heaven or hell, but it satisfies itself that living a moral life is the taqwa that the Quran is asking for. So it emphasizes the values of honesty, integrity, non-violence, generosity, and forgiveness. Traditional theology, on the other hand, has extensive descriptions of the consequences for disbelief and sin. The Quran itself is responsible for that. It uses eternal damnation as a deterrent, and it contains over 200 threats or references, if you prefer, to the great suffering. Adab alim, adab muhim, adab azim, adab al-nar. So it contains those references to the great suffering and the hellfire that awaits those who disobey. But of course, you would only read those passages as threats or about hellfire as being literal if their meaning is fixed. So their meaning can change when you try and relate it to your own personal experience. So for me, al-adab al-alim, wal-adab al-muhin, wal-adab al-azim I've already experienced all of those things in life, distressing situations. But of course, the tradition will say that's not what the Quran is talking about here. So I think if we keep in mind all these axiomatic distinctions between traditional theology and liberation theology, we can come to a better appreciation of why simply proving to traditional exegetes, contemporary traditional exegetes, that they don't have a lot to go on when it comes to banning homosexuality or transgender variants is not enough. Because the traditional exegetes don't necessarily feel there needs to be clear and unequivocal writing on the wall that says same-sex sexual relationships between consenting adults under any circumstances are prohibited Islamically now and for all time. And the reason they don't feel that it's necessary to have that level of scriptural clarity is because of the clarity of the Quran's epistemology, axiology, and ontology from their point of view. It's already very clear. How could you? Basically, from that view, we live in a binary system polarized by biological sex, created purposefully that way by the all-powerful, all-knowing God, so that we may worship him. And anything outside of that is disobedience from a God that demands obedience, absolutely. And what's interesting is that, this kind of critique, the cosmology plays such a critical role here. You see that in the culture wars debates about transgender people, and children requesting and getting access to hormone suppression therapy. There are a lot of right-wing intellectuals in the United States that jump on a bandwagon with respect to that, say that's a form of child abuse because they define men and woman, masculine, feminine, male and female, very much like these traditional Islamic exegetes did or do. So nonetheless, the efforts to deconstruct the spiritual basis of homo and transphobia are actually revealing. So even if the impasse is not in the details, looking at the details is still very, very remarkable. And to anyone with a mind open enough to consider the evidence specifically as it relates to homosexuality and gender variance, there really is a very compelling litigatory argument against the condemnation of same-sex sexuality and gender variance. And so what I'm going to do is I will dedicate the remainder of this lecture to the evidence as it exists in the canonical texts. So more specifically, I'll focus on the hadith, because it really just shows you how critical a role the interpretative tradition plays in developing what we have now. The methodology I use here is indebted to Islamic feminism, which goes back to interrogate canonical texts, their accuracy, their patriarchal assumptions, their biases, and very often convincingly constructs an alternative theology which is affirming of women in early Muslim societies and women's rights in Islam. Without Islamic feminism, we could not have a queer-friendly Islamic hermeneutics. It really paved the way for us. So let me give you just an example that when I apply the Islamic feminist methodology, for example, the fact that it was the world's first Muslim woman, Khadija, who was a successful business owner, who proposed marriage to the world's first Muslim man, Muhammad. So that very obscure fact seems revolutionary by today's standards in mainstream Islam. So for the second time in this lecture, please let me start at the end. What do I think after 20 years in this field about the scriptural basis for the condemnation of homosexuality in Islam? I think the scriptural basis for prohibiting homosexuality and gender variance has been constructed over time by the exegetes, but I also think they will very likely have been causes for that construction, influences on that construction that existed at the time of the Prophet as well. I also think that the evidence in support of the exegetes, contemporary exegetes' current arguments is still scant. So there's not a lot to go on when they still, so there's a lot of opportunity for change is what I'm saying. I also think that it's perfectly plausible to see the story of Lot itself from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And no, I haven't seen anybody propose this story. I've seen people say, oh, the people of Lot were criminals, they were assaulting travelers and so on and so forth. But it is plausible to see the story of Lot as potentially in itself a homophobic exaggeration of a society in which men engaged in orgiastic activities with each other. Alternatively, it's also perfectly plausible that if such a community of men existed in Sodom and Gomorrah, that they also practiced sexual violence on other men or boys. And all of these configurations are possible, and they muddy the water with respect to efforts that attempt to distinguish between consensual adult relationships, sexual violence, and timeless guidance on human sexual behavior. I also think that one particular hadith scholar from the 9th century, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, is the most responsible for ensuring the collection, relation, and survival of multiple hadiths from a small number of narrators who tell several basic stories in different formats. And just a note on who Ahmad ibn Hanbal was, he was a 9th century Islamic scholar who was persecuted under Al-Khalif al-Ma'mun's religious inquisition. He did not believe the Quran was created, and al-Ma'mun was trying to bring religious doctrine under the sway of his political power. So he set up an inquisition, and Ibn Hanbal was at odds with that inquisition. And he was widely known and respected for a particularly conservative way of interpreting the Quran and the Hadiths. He actually had about 100,000 followers during the Abbasid Caliphate, and which is why they did not kill him, because if they had killed him, he would have become a martyr, and he was more dangerous dead than alive. Eventually, Ibn Hanbal would help with Wahhabi revivalism. So in the 18th century, Muhammad Abdul Wahhab relied a lot on Ahmad ibn Hanbal's books of hadith and interpretations. And in the 20th century, there was the rise of the Salafi movements, or the resurgence of the Salafi movements. All of these, both of these widely exist in present-day Saudi Arabia. So let's just go through the stories that we find in hadith collections that first reference effeminate men and masculine women, and then we'll look at the hadith stories that pertain to the people of Lot, and then we'll take a quick look at if there's anything about sexual relationships between women. So in terms of, let's start with the effeminacy. Let's start with gender variance. Let's call it gender variance. There are about 5 different story types that reappear with slight variation across the hadith literatures. The first one I'm going to share with you is the story of hate. Sometimes hate is unnamed, so it just refers to a mukhannath, who's an effeminate man, definitely not a eunuch, but the interpretation is this is a man, so biological sex, presumably male. Even that's problematic of defining it this way, but let's think about things the way people thought about them back in the 7th and 9th centuries, who doesn't min ahl al-irba, which means it doesn't appear to have sexual desire or cannot be sexually aroused by women. And so as a result, what we learn from this particular hadith that I'll discuss with you is that such individuals had access to the women's quarters. They spent time with the women because they were seen to be like women, right? So they weren't restricted from them. And the story of hate is related by Salma, who is one of the Prophet's wives, and it's also told sometimes from the perspective of Aisha, the Prophet's youngest wife. And there's some slight variations. So it suggests that the women were there. And the story is in Sahih al-Bukhari, so it's considered to be authentic. And I mean, for those of you who don't know, there was hate was at the Salma's house, and the Prophet was with his companions. They were fighting, against some other faction. and Hayt turns to one of the male companions of the Prophet and says, if you win the battle tomorrow, let me show you such and such woman. And he describes the physical attributes of that woman. You know, she's very voluptuous, she's very curvaceous. When the Prophet hears him say that, he gives the order to kick him out of the house, and he bans such persons, or people like him, from coming into the women's quarters. So he puts an end to that mixing, right? So that's the first story. The second story, which probably seems like a blanket generalization of what actually happened, but maybe it's not, maybe it's a different incident, is a blanket damnation of men who resemble women and women who resemble men. Sometimes it's called the damnation, so la'ana Rasulullah, you know, men who resemble women and women who resemble men, and sometimes it will use the actual nouns for those such persons, and it's like, so la'ana Rasulullah al-mukhanathin min al-rijal al-mutarajjilat min al-nisa. Mukhanathin, I'm interpreting it as effeminate men, mutarajjilat as masculine women. And these hadiths, this version of the hadith is attributed to Ibn Abbas or Abi Huraira. And this story is also important because it is in Sahih al-Bukhari as well. Now let's take a moment and think about, look at who Ibn Abbas or Abi Huraira were, because this is important. These were companions of the Prophet, so you know, they were around when the Prophet was there. So, and they are responsible for a lot of the hadiths, as you'll see. Ibn Abbas was born in circa 619 Common Era, about 3 years before Hijrah, in 622. So he really could not have been a companion of the Prophet for very long, and not as an adult, because the Prophet died approximately 10 years later. So Ibn Abbas may have been 14, 15 at the most. Some medieval scholars try to make Ibn Abbas older than he is by up to another 15 years to make his hadith narration seem more authentic. Abi Huraira, on the other hand, was clearly an opponent of Aisha, the Prophet's youngest wife. They frequently contradicted each other's testimonies and admonished each other's characters. You know, she accuses him, I mean, of misogyny. It's not specifically that word, but also in Sahih Muslim, she accuses him of making up hadiths falsely, attributing them to the Prophet. So, and Umar ibn Khattab is said to have beat Abu Huraira for telling lies. And Al-Imam Al-Imam Abu Hanifa didn't think much of his character either. He had said in Sahih al-Muslim that there were 3 people out of all the companions of the Prophet whose hadith testimonies he didn't trust, and Abu Huraira was one of those 3 people. So the third story about gender variance that repeats is the order to exile mukhanathin, and sometimes mutarajjilat, from the house, feminine acting men and masculine acting women. And this story type comes from Ibn Abbas again, and sometimes from Akrama, but who's usually telling it through Ibn Abbas. Akrama was a warrior who fought alongside the Prophet. So he was a companion, but he said, sometimes it's like Akrama said the Prophet said, and sometimes says Akrama said that Ibn Abbas said, right? So, and it's interesting to kind of see the progression from a very particular story about a mukhannath who did something wrong, got kicked out of the house, and then the Prophet kind of wanted to protect the privacy, presumably of the women, and so banned that intermixing, to the second version where it's a blanket condemnation. The Prophet has damned masculine women and effeminate men, feminine acting men. And the third one is the order to exile them. So you didn't just damn them with words. Now there is a punishment. Whenever you see them, exile them. The fourth story is that of a mukhannath who dyed his hands in henna. It's related by Abi Huraira. It's not in the Sahih of Bukhari or Muslim, but basically the Prophet is told about an effeminate man who decorates his hands in henna, and he was then subsequently ordered to be exiled. Finally, this is very rare. You don't see it in books of hadith very often, but it is mentioned in Bukhari. And the only place I actually saw it was in Bukhari. And I did look at about 83 tafsir collections. And it says that it's related by Al-Azhari. What does it say? Oh, don't pray behind a mukhannath unless absolutely necessary. So this seems very different from if you see them, exile them, right? So there's a lot in there to question. Let's take a look at the narratives about Qawm Lut, right? There are 4 stories that repeat in story topologies that repeat. And so what are they? The first one is that the Prophet has been heard saying that what most concerns me for my people is the doing of Qawm Lut. So I'm really worried about this becoming a thing among my people. And we don't know what the doings of Qawm Lut is. Presumably a lot of revisionist scholars have said they're talking about sexual violence, or they're talking about highway robbery, or they're talking about impropriety, or whatever it is. The second story is the allegation that the Prophet has damned those who do the doings of Qawm Lut. It's attributed to Akrama and Ibn Abbas, and sometimes also attributed to Abi Huraira, right? So he's damned people who do the doings of Qawm Lut. And the third one is that the Prophet has said, kill the doer and the done too, which is attributed to Akrama and Ibn Abbas. Now it's gone from I'm worried about this to blanket damnation, these people are damned, to actually kill them. And what's interesting here is that when you kill the doer and the done to, there's a presumption here that the done to is not a victim of sexual violence, presumably. Then again, the concept of sexual violence may not have existed, right? And there couldn't have been an ability to distinguish between the victim of a crime and the person committing it. But it does potentially suggest consensual sexual activity. So number 4, those who commit the doing of Qawm Lut should be stoned, right? So we've gone from concern, damnation, kill them, and more specifically, how to kill them. This is probably the most remarkable version because the ownership of this hadith is complex. And when you look at it really closely, you see how it was constructed over time. Because the earliest references to this hadith, such as in Musnaf Abd al-Raziq, don't actually implicate the Prophet at all, but refer to various sources without saying that the Prophet said this. Ibn Majah is the first hadith collector to attribute this saying to the Prophet, but it is still through Abi Huraira, right? And we have question marks over Abi Huraira. Aisha has specifically said he makes things up and attributes them to the Prophet. In Nasb al-Raya by Zay Ali, sorry, I didn't write the Arabic name, so it might be Zay Ali or Zay Ali, I'm not sure. It doesn't have a silsila and doesn't implicate the Prophet. So there's no chain of transmission, and it's not saying the Prophet said it. And Takhlis al-Habir by al-Asqalani questions that this hadith by Abi Huraira could even be sound. Finally, there's really only one narrative that discusses what you do with women who are found to be having sexual contact with each other. This narrative institutes the idea that the Prophet said that 2 such women are fornicators, zaniyatan. But it takes quite some time for the concept to crystallize. So let's look at it. I put them in chronological order. So there are some overlaps. So Masnad al-Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, austere scholar in the 9th century who was persecuted under the Abbasid Mihna. He relates a hadith that Jabir was asked about women having sexual contact with women, and he said that the Prophet forbade it, but that's it. He said the Prophet forbade it. Then in the book by Abi Shayba, also 9th century, there's a section on women mounting, on a woman mounting another woman. That's the name of the section. And we get 2 related hadiths. It's a very short section. And neither of those hadiths are attributed to the Prophet. So you can see Ahmad ibn Hanbal was working on this project very early on to make sure, even if he didn't have a silsila, or even if he didn't have a full story, a full context for this forbidding, to make sure that that the Prophet said it. By contrast, his contemporary said that the first story that he relates is attributed to Al-Zahiri, who was asked about this and said that she should be punished at the lower end of the punishment spectrum. So some scholars believe that there were major sins and minor sins, and they had different types of punishments. And in this particular case, he's saying this will be considered a minor sin, so you should punish her according to the punishments for minor sins. تضرب أدنى الحدين. The second narration is from Salim bin Abdullah bin Amr, who said that when a woman mounts another woman, both will meet God as sinners. So Ahmad ibn Hanbal makes sure that there's something that says the Prophet forbade this, and his contemporary just says these two men, these are the teachings or the fatwas that these two men have given about what you do with women who are seen to have some kind of sexual contact with each other. In the 11th century, Kitab al-Sunan al-Kubra, there is a hadith related to Abi Musa al-Ash'ari that alleges that the Prophet said that a woman does not come to another woman without them both being fornicators. And he says the same of two men. So you can see it took quite some time from the 7th century to the 11th for, for crossing the I's and, crossing the T's and dotting the I's on the prohibition of same-sex sexual contact between women. It was achieved far sooner for men because understandably in a patriarchal worldview, that's a much more dangerous thing than to have women, breaking the doctrine. And it's not actually until the 15th century Common Era that we get a hadith in Majma' al-Zawaid wa Manba' al-Fawaid that's attributed to Wathila, who is not a companion of the Prophet. So it's a hadith maqtu'a. It's a hadith that doesn't go all the way back to a companion. And it's a hadith that says the Prophet has said that suhaq, so this word now emerges, which is sexual contact between women, it's grinding, is the way women perform zina, the way they perform fornication together. And zina is a major sin. You get severely punished for it. And so it takes until the 15th century for that to come in. In the same collection, a man named Abu Musa shares that a woman does not come into sexual contact with another woman unless they are both fornicators. So as you can see, when we do the work of tracing the history of an idea and how it evolved through time, it's that much harder to maintain the mythology around it. It seems almost intuitive at first that Islam is not a religion that champions gender and sexual diversity, and that's because of the characteristics of the contexts of its emergence, tribal, patriarchal, 7th century Arab peninsula, spreading through canonization at the height of Islamic civilization, mostly in Baghdad during the Abbasid Caliphate of the 9th century. This was the time, though, when scholarship and methodology were very important. I actually have deep respect for Tabari's towering scholarly accomplishments, but I don't see a reason to stop there. And I'm not sure if Tabari himself would have actually wanted us to. I don't think he said, I'm going to explain what the Quran means and that's it. I think it was like, if you think of it as developing a scientific method, you're supposed to do it through experimentation and testing hypotheses. The problem with contemporary scholars using the story of Lot as evidence of Islam's condemnation of homosexuals or homosexuality is that they are in the 21st century using the logic and comprehension of human phenomena and non-human phenomena of people who existed 5,000 years ago, right? Because Lot is a contemporary of Abraham, right? So supposedly this is a really old story. We as humanity have learned so much more about the world since then and can interpret these ancient stories a lot more effectively with what we know now than with what we knew then, or what we knew in the 7th century when the Quran was revealed, or in the 9th century when interpretation was canonized. The irony, of course, is that as a scholar who's inquiring about the Quran in a way full of openness and curiosity and being very methodical, I actually have a lot more in common with Tabari and al-Bukhari than I do with contemporary exegetes who no longer see a need to continue evolve the science of Quranic interpretation. I think the Islamic 9th century was an extraordinary step in human civilization. I often reflect on the ways the existence of the Quran bolstered Arabic literacy, Arab letters. It even encouraged scientific exploration and methodology, because it was the starting point of collating information, corroborating it, validating it, archiving it, you know. So somewhere, somehow, the effort to innovate became calcified and turned from being revolutionary to becoming an orthodoxy. In the same way that the world's first Muslim woman proposed marriage to the world's first Muslim man, that was a revolutionary time, eventually became, calcified and ossified, and became an orthodoxy, where that, in Muslim majority contexts, that's not something that's very common, at least from the Arabo-Islamic cultures where I have lived and worked. Now, orthodoxies struggle with the passage of time. That's what's so difficult for them. If time were immutable, orthodoxies would work very well. But given that time changes, and that people are vastly different, this is why ultimately they start to fall apart. And if the God that they describe is Rabb al-Alameen, then it is a God for all of humanity, as they say. And so the choice point really is the purpose of Islam assimilatory? Is the point that everyone needs to become the same? Or are Islamic texts indeed so complex that they have the ability to speak to different peoples in different times and places in such a way that remains timeless and relevant? And again, that is a critical foundational distinction between traditional Islamic theology and queer liberation, Islamic liberation theology. So once again, we return to where we started. The impasse between these two frameworks is not in the details, it's in the structure. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Yeah, thank you so much for this really, really interesting and enriching talk. I wrote down a lot of things, so maybe I'll start with like 1 or 2 points, and anyone else feel free to write your comments or questions in the chat, or just raise your hand like before. Yeah, I thought it was great to hear this very detailed historical perspective, and as you said, this development of these ideas from over such a long period of time, and also to hear this analysis kind of beyond the story of Lut alone, which is, I think, what a lot of these texts also kind of focus on. Oh yeah, we have to stop the recording. I always forget this.